Okay. Okay. For all of you who have joined, we're just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes for others to join. It's just 8. Well, let me welcome everyone and start with a bit of an introduction while others join. And let me say thank you so much for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where in the world you are. My name is Barbara Beer. I am the faculty director of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, and really delighted to be hosting with my colleagues this meeting. We're going to be talking about advancing international pediatric clinical research, and really for this meeting, talking about or using COVID-19 experience as a lens through which to analyze the problems attendant in running these kinds of trials and research efforts. I'm delighted to say that this series, and it's the first of 5 that we plan to have, is supported by the FDA Scientific Conference grant, and we thank them for their support. So could I have the next slide? And just wanted to say this is the first of 5 webinar series. Last night to me, we had a similar conference, different speakers, same topics, which we really did in order to allow a wide audience participation from around the world. One of the wonderful things, if there is a silver lining to COVID-19, is the fact that we can all join virtually. The problem is we are all in different time zones still. So we needed to space this to allow for everyone to have the ability to participate. This conference was planned as an offshoot of a project that the MRCT Center is doing on this topic and promoting global clinical research in children. Could I have the next slide? And the MRCT Center, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a research and policy center at Harvard, and the Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is really dedicated to improving the ethics, conduct, and regulatory environment of international clinical research, with a vision to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. We do that by engaging diverse stakeholders, industry, patient advocates, academia, CROs, regulators, whomever is involved in an issue, identify those issues, define them, but then really to spend time together working on solutions or approaches that work for all, thinking that if they are endorsed by different stakeholders in the clinical research environment, that it is more likely to be successful. Could I have the next slide? So one of the reasons that I don't have to tell this audience is that we need to improve our infrastructure and ability to conduct and enthusiasm for conducting clinical research in children. Children obviously, and I don't have to say this here, deserve access to safe and effective medicines, and we can't know that unless we really include them in research. Many of the conditions affecting children are rare and therefore widely dispersed across the globe. And in order to, do these trials or understand the impact of an intervention in real time, we should be doing multinational clinical research when we can. But there are persistent ethical issues about when to enroll, how to enroll. There are different regulatory constructs across the globe, and there are lots of problems, even if with trial initiation and conduct, that we want to sort of work to understand and overcome together. And finally, as we've appreciated over the last number of years, the participant voice in both the design, planning, outcome choice, and research, and then in the conduct is very, very important. And we have rarely included pediatric participants or pediatric patients, whatever, as voices in the planning of research and the thinking about research, and are working on improving having their voice, the family's voice, to ensure a seat at the table. So with that, next slide, we started about 1.5 years ago working on improving international pediatric research. It was co-led as a project by myself and Steve Jaffe, an ethicist and pediatric oncologist at the University of Pennsylvania. Lisa Koppelman, whom I think all of you know, was instrumental in working with us from the MRCT Center, Skip Nelson from Johnson & Johnson, and Dominic Harris from the European Medicines Agency. But the leadership group could not have done this without the 80+ members, as I said, representing multiple stakeholders, where we strove for geographic diversity. We had monthly meetings for 90 minutes for over 1 year. And then in between those monthly meetings, 3 subgroups met, one at the decision-making to focus on decision-making at the level of the child or family, one on benefit risk considerations at the level of the IRB or ethics committee, and one sort of thinking about the governance, regulatory cooperation, as well as operations and sort of the conduct, the practical issues of doing these trials. So out of that grew this conference. Could I have the next slide, please? And series of conferences where we really wanted to look at the global landscape, identify current initiatives to improve pediatric research, and think about these challenges on decision-making on and behalf of children, and then the benefit risk considerations and engagement. Could I have the next slide, please? So yesterday and today, we're talking about the future of clinical research and what we've learned from COVID-19 and what we should do equivalently or differently going forward. We're going to talk about in the first panel, when is the right time to initiate clinical trials and to have considerations for pediatrics in any response to a pandemic or actually disease, and then talk about the infrastructure. We're going to follow that next winter with thinking about the decision-making after study approval and how to involve the pediatric participant voice in those decisions, and then talk about the decision benefit risk analysis at the level of the ethics committee and oversight, and then regulatory convergence, and then one follow-on summary conference. Could I have the next slide? So today I'm really delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Mojisola Christiana Adiaye, who I was privileged to meet a number of years ago in her participation in AVREF, the African Vaccines Regulatory Forum. She is the Director General of the National Agency for Food and Drug Administration and Control, NAFDAC, which is the equivalent Food and Drug Administration regulatory agency and health authority for Nigeria. She was trained at the University of Nigeria and then did her PhD at the University of Georgia in Athens, US. She is the inaugural chair of, or was the inaugural chair of biopharmaceutical sciences and a professor of pharmaceutics, manufacturing science and drug product evaluation at the College of Pharmacy in Schaumburg, Illinois, a senior Fulbright scholar and specialist, and a fellow of the American Association of Pharmaceutical Sciences, the Nigerian Academy of Science, and the Nigeria Academy of Pharmacy, and has really had the responsibility and of coordinating the response in Nigeria and in part across Africa for the response to COVID-19, amongst her many other responsibilities. And it's really a pleasure to introduce her today and allow her time for to share her perspectives. But I do want to say that if you have questions for her, we will have time at the end. Please put your questions in the Q&A box that you see so that we can get to them when there is time. Professor.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I would like to thank the MRCT group for inviting me as the keynote speaker at this particular meeting. Very important to me because it's all about children. And I was in the US for 37 years, and about half of my professor or academic enterprise was spent on children, dosage form development and clinical trials in Nigeria. Next, please. I'm going to just quickly go through the outline in terms of the perspectives of pediatric clinical trials. Why is it so important? And the rationale behind that. What are the challenges in pediatric clinical trials, especially in Africa? As a regulator, we have a lot of challenges. And of course, the lessons learned, which is part of the theme of this series, the lessons learned from COVID-19. And what are the efforts that NAFDAC as a regulatory agency in Nigeria is making Next, please. In terms of perspectives, it is extremely important to have a high quality, cost-effective pediatric clinical trials in order to have robust therapeutics or prophylactics in terms of the different diseases that affect children. However, this requires a lot of planning, research, good regulatory infrastructure or framework, and properly trained workforce to implement science-driven and ethics-driven clinical trials. Therapeutic products licensed for adults, all of us know that are frequently used in pediatric populations. And that was part of what led to different changes around the 2012. I'm going to talk about that in the US, FDA. Regulators, researchers, and society all share ethical responsibility in terms of providing resources necessary, and the resources intellectual and financial resources. And that is one of the reasons why I want to thank Barbara again for this meeting, because from what we have learned from COVID, if it affects one part of the world, essentially it affects other parts of the world. Next, please. Government regulations and policies are required, of course, in terms of clinical trials, and also incentives for the conduct of clinical trials. As a regulatory agency, we are working on this as we speak, and globally, continentally, this is part of what I've been trying to include in our own agenda as the African Medicine Regulatory Harmonization, of which I'm the steering committee chair, why we should focus more on pediatrics, dosage form development, clinical trials, extremely important. However, the pediatric research enterprise must be carried out with diligence. I've mentioned that. These issues that we are facing right now in Africa and in Nigeria in particular are the issues that US faced towards the end of the 20th century. And in 2012, US FDA, the Safety and Innovation Act, FDA Asia, was set up to strengthen the priority initiatives in pediatric product development, and also made permanent the Pediatric Research Equity Act. So this efforts to focus more on children, dosage form development, clinical trials, all efforts that have to be made by the government, by the regulatory agencies, the society as a whole. And the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the PRIA are very instrumental in what is going on now in the US. And again, I want to emphasize that is why this multi-regional approach that MRCT is giving to clinical research is extremely important. Next, please. As a result of the new approach or new philosophy concerning children, a lot is being done. Positive outcomes from the FDA, about 340 written requests for new pediatric studies, and subsequently approval of more than 450 labeling changes associated with BPCA and PRIA. Very important because like I mentioned before, it used to be that, okay, adults take 2 tablespoons, children 1 tablespoon or whatever, extrapolation, which didn't really work. So what is going on at the FDA right now is a gold standard that many regulatory agencies are trying to copy. In Europe, the pediatric plan is also there to focus more on implementation of pediatric approvals of drug process approval and clinical trials. Evidence for a more robust pediatric product development pipeline also comes from the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association in the US, because once the regulatory changes, the industry will change. And that has led to about 300 medicines in development for children that are focused for children. With children come rare diseases, genetically based, and that poses a challenge, which I'm also going to be talking about. We have about 6,500 rare genetic diseases, primarily affecting children. And that is, again, a challenge. And that led to a lot of regulatory reforms at the FDA, with the FDA Office of Orphan Product Development, in order to make sure that this population is captured, and they play, this is sizable population amongst children and the diseases that affect them. Next, please. In terms of NAFDAC, we have the act actually that established NAFDAC, which was modified in 2004, puts the burden to regulate and control, importation, exportation, manufacture, advertisement, distribution, sale, and use of food, drugs, cosmetics, medical devices, and packaged water and chemicals. This particular parent act is supported by what is called the CAP F33, and of course our NAFDAC GCP guidelines and the NAFDAC good practices for pharmaceutical quality control laboratory guidelines. This is extremely important as we evolve as an agency. And one good thing that is happening to NAFDAC now is that since 2018, we embraced quality systems, without which you cannot have pediatric clinical trials, robust clinical trials. And also we are going through the global benchmarking audit by WHO. And clinical trial is one of the 7 functions that we have to, as a regulatory agency, to meet the recommendations. Before 3.5 years ago, we had about 268 recommendations to meet. And as I speak, we have only about 3 left. And this is continuous self-auditing, and of course, WHO continuous global auditing. So the emphasis here is that without a solid regulatory framework, no country can have good clinical trial. No part of the world can have good clinical trial enterprise. Next, please. So from our own mandate, our goal is to safeguard public health, ensuring that the medicines that are consumed are safe, efficacious, and that the clinical trials are done using international best practices. Next, please. Well, why clinical trials in Africa? It goes without saying. In inadequate clinical services have yet to be established in majority of African countries, where childhood cancer survival rates vary from 8.1% to 30.3%. Looking at clinicaltrials.gov, it's only about 12.1 African oncology studies included children and adolescents. 50.5% were interventional trials, palliative care, leukemia trials, things like that. Less than 1% of pediatric oncology publications come from Africa. And again, I want to emphasize the objective of MRCT, multi-regional clinical trials. If these objectives are met, this less than 1% will jump up. Just before the meeting, I've forgotten who was talking that there was an ethics meeting that was done virtually from 19 African countries. That is the beauty of COVID pandemic. And we are all meeting from different parts of the world, different times, settings, and we are all here. With this multi-regional approach, a lot can be done. Next, please. I want to show this slide that is about pediatric oncology services in Africa. You can see the light grayish blue countries that have full-time pediatric oncology services. The maroon or the reddish ones, no, there was no full-time pediatric oncology services. And no data available in some of these countries. The emphasis here is that there may be pediatric oncology services, but to what extent do we have pediatric oncology services, even in the areas that are painted grayish blue? Next, please. Collaboration, extremely important. And again, I want to take home message is what the objective of MRCT is, multi-regional clinical trials. That will go a long way. On this slide, you see the African-based oncology fellowship programs that are, of course, associated with the US and Europe. And of course, the French collaborations spotted all over the continent. And of course, South African and African fellowship progress collaborations. Collaboration is extremely important, and COVID-19 pandemic has also taught us that, and taught us also the ease to collaborate with a Zoom or virtual technology. It's extremely important that we emphasize collaboration. Next, please. Again, rationale, this is just underscoring what Barbara started with. Children have the right to the highest attainable level of health enunciated by the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Children are not small people, they're not small adults, they are children. And the effectiveness that we expect cannot be realized if therapy for children is based on mere extrapolation. Children and adults, of course, differ in physiological capabilities, kinetics profile, dynamics characteristics, metabolic pathways, organ function. Even between the ages of 0 neonatal to 12, there are about 3 or 4 categories of classification among children because of the metabolic pathways that are different from different age brackets. That is, so it's not just below 12 or below 6. It is actually breaking them down and tailoring the formulation and the clinical trials to reflect those categorizations. And then disparity in terms of receptor functions, effector system, and homeostatic mechanisms. We have to think of that always. And age, growth, and development, of course, all these influence side effects of drugs. Those medication now is largely dependent on body weight or surface area, and the influence of severity and type of disease and pathological agents will also influence the outcomes or the efficacy of the therapeutics. Next, please. Well, challenges. The conduct of clinical trials has, a lot of challenges. The complexity of clinical trial in pediatric population. I just mentioned the categorization, the detailed categorization among even pediatrics themselves. And of course, the rare disease, the fact that we have, many of the diseases that affect children that are rare. And when you talk of rare, we're talking of maybe less than 200,000 from the US Orphan Drug Act definition. Elsewhere, maybe 1 in 2,000, 1 in 50,000. So you can see that the limited number of subjects also will pose a challenge. Next, please. Okay, in terms, continuation of or talking about challenges, approximately 80% of the thousands of defined rare diseases are genetically based, and 50% of these affect children. So the focus on genetic polymorphism extremely important when we are thinking of development of the dosage forms and of course the clinical trial. And many of these rare diseases lack treatments. Many times they are fatal. So making new treatments potentially transformative for the lives of the patients. In addition to being genetically based, these diseases, the responses also will be genetically driven. And also difficulty satisfying regulatory requirements for therapeutic study of human diseases is another challenge, which it may be challenges in both ways, from the sponsor side, from the regulatory side. That is why the different transformations that have taken place in FDA in terms of pediatric dosage form development and clinical trials are very important. And these difficulties include appropriate trial design, the ethics in terms of recruitment, the consent, the assent for these patients, funds to support the research, and inadequate sample size. I mentioned that in case of rare diseases. Next, please. Talking of trial design, randomized control trial, blinded is often considered as gold standard for establishing efficacy, but sometimes it's not all the time. It is costly, time consuming, and requires large sample sizes. And where you have limited number of subjects, that is why it cannot always be gold standard that will be needed or used for children. Variability in terms of the different diseases in children. The common diseases have homogeneous clinical causes. In certain children diseases or rare diseases, this may not be the case. Even as a single, with genetic disorders, this cannot even be the case. What of control groups? The use of control groups, of course, will strengthen the trial design by addressing concerns regarding clinical trial variability. However, many of these may cause a shortened lifespan for the children, and there are also ethical concerns about use of placebo-controlled trials. Parents are not willing to give consent to children to be enrolled in placebo-controlled study. That may be a problem in pediatric clinical trials, and how creative can we be in terms of the clinical protocol. Next, please. One challenge is also the natural history and of the patients. Sometimes we don't take this into consideration, but very important. The detailed understanding of the natural history and epidemiology of the disease is very, very crucial in terms of the design. And of course, this informed the criteria for inclusion or exclusion of the children. And also data in the rare diseases cases are scarce due to lack of natural history, because they are rare diseases. For example, the small number of patients, the geographic dispersion, where these patients are, and the small number, like I mentioned before. In Nigeria, there is need, we realize it, to establish prospective data appropriate for use as historical controls in the future, and also a clinical registry of prospective. In prospective studies, we do us a lot, especially in terms of recruitment tools. Next, please. Outcome measures. Very important, lack of clinical rating scales to better quantify the different diseases and increase their precision related to small changes is a challenge. Existing research gaps in biomarker development to support proof of concept is another challenge. And I've mentioned, subject recruitment and retention, subject recruitment, the limited number. But in terms of retention, timely and adequate recruitment of eligible participants is a challenge. Few patients mentioned that, and geographic dispersion. And that's, again, may be the beauty of this multi-regional approach that MRCT is using, because when you have a wider geographic spread in terms of recruitment, you get better robust data set. Next, please. Okay, diseases in significantly impaired children may also be a challenge in terms of moving from one point to the other. And trials involving repurposed drugs may be a challenge in terms of recruitment and retention, because these drugs are already being used being used outside the clinical research. So that could be a challenge. Drug development and funding. I cannot emphasize this too much, because I went through this myself in terms of development of pediatric dosage forms and funding. It is very difficult to come by funding, because many of the pharmaceutical companies look at the population itself and what goes into the development. It takes a lot of efforts, scientific efforts, financing to develop drug products for children, possibly about 2 or 3 times longer time to develop the average dosage formulation for children. So longer timeline is a challenge. And then in comparison with common diseases, when you have rare diseases, you have small markets, and that poses even more challenge in terms of the economic impact and the bottom line for pharmaceutical companies. Of course, lack of funding from government to drive pediatric research is a problem. Lack of trust by development partners to fund research generally in Africa based on past experience can also be a challenge. Next, please. Training. I cannot emphasize this enough. Again, there is positive paucity in clinical research training, and of course in interest as a consequence, especially in Africa. And that is why the Zoom or virtual technology has revolutionized the world. No excuse from low middle income countries, no excuse from developed countries in terms of capacity building, because that can be done so effectively. Before 2020 or in 2019, NAFDAC had about 1,900 plus trainings for the staff. And in 2020, we had 4,818 because we've already set up Zoom technology before in 2018. So we were already used to it. So researcher training is extremely important and much easier now than we ever even thought of. But in terms of clinical researchers in academia, the challenges they face, of course, is balancing the commitment for the clinical research to their own homegrown research and regulatory requirements, lack of local infrastructure. Very, very important to consider. I had a pilot clinical trial in 2006 in Nigeria, in Lagos. Lagos is about 25 million people. And it was good I started from there because I learned that it may be better for me to go to a much quieter in terms of the busyness of the city. So the second clinical trial, which was actually FDA approved clinical trial, was in a smaller city. But the challenge that, of course, I faced, which I was able to overcome, was not just it's not just people that are not as capacitated, but also the infrastructure. I have to bring, first of all, the involvement of the communities is extremely important, because coming from the US or from any part of the world, developed world, there is that suspect, that or suspicion rather, that, oh, what are you coming to do? Things like that. So we had to work, myself and my clinical researcher, the pediatrician, we have to work with the community. We had meetings with them to let them know that where this is going to be for good, we explained to them, talk to them in their language, so to say. So we were able to overcome the community involvement. We did fairly well there. Then I had to bring a CRO chief from the US to that teaching hospital, tertiary hospital, to teach for a week the people that will be involved in the research. And then in terms of infrastructure, because of epileptic supply of power, I have to get a generator to ensure that we run 24/7, to ensure that the samples will be preserved. Of course, this was part of my students, 2 PhD students in Pittsburgh. That was the last chapter of their research, and to ensure that the integrity is preserved. And so we had to do all those things, but it's because I was driven to ensure that this must work, and it's pediatric clinical trial. And we were very successful. The data was sent to the US. There were no compliance directive that were given. So the local infrastructure must be considered, and the training of clinical researchers. And also, of course, lack of opportunities to mentor, sustainable mentoring of younger staff, of faculty, in the different universities, it's a challenge. Knowledge gaps in regulatory requirements. I know that. So we have been training and retraining our staff to ensure that they understand perfectly what goes into clinical trial. And lack of epidemiological data on pediatric clinical trial is also a challenge because of the rare diseases that I mentioned. Next, please.
I don't want to run out of time, so I wonder if we have sort of 5 minutes or so to.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Lessons learned. We learned to adapt from COVID-19 pandemic. That's a business continuity plan that we as a regulatory agents have learned a lot, and to work together. Again, using virtual technology, extremely important. But in terms of children, Barbara mentioned that many of our children, the COVID-19 pandemic trials are like an afterthought, and I know that is like an afterthought. What can we do better? The incidence of symptomatic and severe COVID-19 is lower in children. That is a misconceived idea now. Next, please. As we will see, the COVID-19 pandemic poses many direct and indirect consequences for children's health. It's something that we were learning with time, and the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 is an example of the clinical research that was done, that was not built into the development, and it's a pandemic anyway, so there was no time to start thinking too many opportunities. Collaboration, extremely important. We have learned that this is part of what we are doing here. And early inclusion of children in clinical trials, extremely important. We cannot overemphasize that. Next, please. General assumption that children are not affected by COVID-19 pandemic, we've put that aside and know that it is not the reality. Next, please. In terms of other lessons learned, several positive outcomes for children research have arisen during this period, which is a good continuous lesson being learned. And one example is recognition from across the research spectrum that rapid responsive collaboration can be achieved. Information sharing, very, very important. This is part of what we are doing here. Next, please. And also the recognition that study design may not need multiple complex layers of administration, and that approval process can be streamlined. We are learning that as regulatory agencies all over the world. Next, please. In terms of our continuous efforts in NAFDAC, development of specific guidelines for clinical trials in pediatric population, we did that, I believe, in 2019, 2020. Providing enabling environment for stakeholders engagement through continuous workshops. Plans are underway to organize specialized training for biomedical research. I believe that has actually taken place now. Support and registration of orphan drugs in Nigeria to help the industry develop long-term data. NAFDAC also hopes to develop national guidelines regarding risk stratification of research studies in children. Next, please. And this may be one of the best things that is happening to us. In terms of clinical trials in general, we are making clinical trials very transparent, providing incentives for pediatric dosage form manufacturers, possible product registration waiver. NAFDAC has also launched a platform, electronic clinical trial application platform. We call it eCTAP. That was funded by Gates Foundation, and this is available for all clinical trial sponsors or applicants, including national and international PIs and clinical research organizations. We are trying to make this a national platform because we have what is called the National Ethics Committee that is different from NAFDAC, but we are working together. That is part of our strengthening, regulatory strengthening. Next, please. In conclusion, conducting clinical trials in pediatric population is complex, of course. We have to get it right. Experimental therapeutics for rare diseases, faces many challenges. Despite these challenges, there have been several recent accomplishments, FDA, Europe being examples. It is essential to carry out research in children, of course. We cannot overemphasize that. Regulators, patient groups, patient voices, ethics committees, research institutions, practitioners are all important, and collaboration is what we would need to do. Improve infrastructure and funding for R&D will deliver more than we expect, and that is why the MRCT, again, is a very, very good enterprise in terms of multi-regional clinical trials. Next, and I believe this is my last slide. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak at this very important meeting.
Thank you so much. I mean, I can't think of a better introduction and overview. I think you touched on every major complexity and need in order to build a system that supports children in research. And I have to say, I'm afraid we don't have time for questions, but I think that what you did was outline the kind of scope that we need to think about internationally, because while you spoke from the perspective of Nigeria, I can think of every country that needs strengthening in some domain or another, or in many of these domains. And your leadership there and on behalf of the continent, I think is just transformative. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
It is only from developing this kind of perspective and strength, infrastructure and knowledge that we'll all be able to cooperate in clinical trials internationally.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely excellent. So with that, let me move on to our first panel. I can't think of a better setup than Professor Moji's description. And today we are going to be talking in the first panel about sort of what is the right timing? How do you think about bringing children into clinical research at a time when you have some data or no data, or from adults or other places? I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Dr. Angeliki Siapkara, who comes to us from MHRA UK. If you could go back one slide. And the rest of the panel, just to get the introductions done so we can move swiftly, is Dr. Narendra Kumar Arora, who is from India, the Inclin Trust International, and then Dr. Grace Koo from the Institute of Tropical Medicine, currently in Belgium, but also in the Philippines, and Dr. Danusha Ramdan, who is from the University of Wits in South Africa. So a wonderful international panel. We look forward to hearing from you.
To introduce our first panelist, which is Dr. Arora, who comes from India. And you can see there that he's the Executive Director of International Clinical Epidemiology Network in New Delhi. And I'll let him tell us a little bit about himself and his views on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angelica. And in fact, this session couldn't have been better moderated, but a regulator. And so you bring in very diverse and rich perspective. So talking about COVID, I think a very important component which needs to be kept in mind is that children, for example, are generally not affected. And but the risk of infection is very similar to adults. So if you serosurveys in various parts, including in India, which shows that seropositivity is very much like adults. But of all the symptomatic less than 10% below 18 are symptomatic. On mortality also, of the overall mortality, less than 0.5% is in the pediatric. So overall, the message is that the disease is mild or asymptomatic, but there is a high risk. Now, I was thinking that actually, and there is a lot of talk going on now, that healthy children otherwise do not require immunization. It makes sense. Actually, children are vectors. So once adults are fully immunized, they are protected. And if there is still vaccine available, doses available, maybe one goes to children. But what about high-risk children? For example, those receiving chemotherapy for cancer, or on immunosuppression for other reasons, or those who have type 1 diabetes or morbid obesity, which global data is showing that they may be having higher risk of morbidity, risk of hospitalization and mortality also. Now, currently, as we know that mRNA vaccine is the only one which people are using, and I think some 9 or 10 or 19 countries are using across the globe. And that is mostly for the same adolescent group, 12 to 17 years. Question is that one suggestion which you have given very rightly, that in the trial group, adolescents 12 to 17 years are also included. I think that makes a very good sense. On the other hand, there are people who are worried, whether rightly or wrongly, that a vaccine like mRNA may, because it's a genetic material, it's a nucleic acid, should we give this injection or not, this vaccine or not? Recently in India, we have got a DNA vaccine, it's a plasmid. These are absolutely new platforms. Now, if I have to wait for next 5 years to see the long-term effect of a DNA vaccine, then this particular innovation is practically useless as far as children are concerned. We are depriving them of the benefit, particularly those who are high risk, who are likely to die if they get the infection. And their parents, obviously, they must be most protected. And these are the people who need some kind of a special care. So I think we need to be change our mindset on one. I like this phrase that mindset has to change. This is particularly important, that if mindset is not changed, pregnancy immunization wouldn't have taken up. I think people over the time got confident that vaccinating pregnant women is not only beneficial for her, but for her child also, for her fetus. Similarly, I think for parents, for children also, we need to start thinking little more, I would say, boldly and with confidence, that at least those at high risk, they need to be taken care of in a situation where we are talking about pandemic, or it was influenza pandemic previously. And I think this requires a couple of prerequisites. Most of the vaccine manufacturers are not doing DART studies, or so what the vaccine has impact on the fetal development, because that will give confidence both to the scientific community and also to the community at large. One. Number two, that when the vaccines are used or drugs are used for children in a situation like emergency situation like this, we need to look at the risk and benefit. Rare disease is something which is primarily for pediatric age group, younger age group. So there is no option at all. We have to do it. But on the other hand, in a pandemic-like situation, we need to think about vaccines, therapeutic agents, that they must be introduced particularly for high-risk population in the pediatric. And the only, what one should say, the caveat is, particularly in a country like ours, low and middle income countries, where follow-up for adverse events need to be very meticulous. That because largely our quality of surveillance for adverse events is not as good as it is desirable. But if it is focused that when we are including children, the adverse event follow-up, so that it again gives confidence to everybody involved, all the stakeholders. So in summary, I would reiterate that children are forgotten, particularly those at high risk. And in situations of emergency like currently, we should change our mindset and be ready to take some bold steps and do it in a manner that some of the prerequisites in the preclinical settings are also completed, and post when the any drug or vaccine is given, more closer monitoring of adverse events is done. Not to be bothered about long-term effect. The reason is that even asymptomatic disease may be causing a barrage of long COVID-related symptoms. So if we don't do that, I think we are missing a great opportunity. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arora, for this excellent contribution. And we will have time once all our panelists have expressed their views to come back to some of your comments. So our next speaker, next slide, is Dr. Koo from Belgium, and is a senior researcher in the Institute and lecturer in the Institute of Tropical Medicines in Belgium. Dr. Koo, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeliki. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm looking at this from a public health point of view because I'm a public health specialist as well. And in prioritization of health interventions and in the generation of evidence for these said interventions, we try to look at how important the problem is. We look at economic costs, social costs, suffering, and most of this would be directly related to having the disease and to current productivity of the people affected by the health problem. Next, please. So this could equate to the burden of the disease, the incidence, the prevalence, how many are dying, the morbidity, the years of life lost, years of life with disability, and the disability adjusted life years. A colleague from the clinical trials unit told me that usually it is more easy to get funding for children because when you compare the DALYs for children, let's say you do a trial that will save an 8-year-old children as compared to a 40-year-old person, then you would have more disability adjusted life years for the child as compared to the 40-year-old person. However, when it comes to emergencies and we do some reactive actions, next slide, please, we tend to neglect the other effects on children. Next slide, please. And so we focus more on how many are dying, how many have been infected, but then we forget that pandemics, such as the COVID-19, is a wicked problem, and solutions could give rise to other problems, which, for example, going back to the Spanish influenza epidemic from in the 1920s. Next slide, please. This is the story of Anthony Burquez. He's an author from the UK, where his father was a soldier. So his father went home to find Anthony laughing, but the mother and his sister were already dead. So the mother was 30 years old and the sister was said to be 4 years old or 8 years old when she died. Next, please. However, when we look at the data from the Spanish flu pandemic, the focus was mainly on the adults, especially the 20 to 40-year-old age group, because these were the most severely affected age group. And also, next slide, please. Children above 2 years old were not covered by any available data sets because they were not being monitored. So we don't know how many really of these children were affected by the Spanish flu pandemic. So next slide, please. Looking at these non-lessons from past pandemics involving children and the historical hesitancy of including children and also pregnant women in the early stages of clinical trials. And compounded by the current prioritization practices for research at the time of COVID-19, and not to mention the restrictions brought about by the pandemic on children's mobility, like school closures, or even countries prohibiting those less than 18 years of age to go out, then the effects are not only directly because of the infection, because of the death secondary to the infection, because of the morbidity secondary to infection, but we need to focus also on the mental health of the children. Sure, less children are being infected, less children are dying, but if you look at studies on the mental health of children, there are more problems now regarding mental health, depression, anxiety, especially among those considered to be normal or not having a history of mental health prior to the pandemic. And so if we look at this, what will happen if we project the DALYs of these children? But we tend to overlook this and react mainly on the numbers of the mortalities and the morbidities, which are admittedly more important, of course, but then we are forgetting also some important aspects. So next slide, please. So considering these experiences from COVID-19, and I would say that we now have more data as compared to the Spanish flu epidemic. Where do we want to go with regards to research involving children, not only for their inclusion for COVID-19 vaccines, but also ongoing research which were interrupted or planned research which will be affected because of changing priorities? And how do we plan to get there? Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Koo for this excellent presentation. And again, please put any questions you might have in the Q&A for our discussion later. So to our last panelist, it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ramdin. She's the head of the Neonatology and Pediatric Intensive Care Unit in Johannesburg Academic Hospital in South Africa, and has done a lot of work around neonates and also with COVID and mother and child group. So please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeliki. Thank you to the MRCT for affording me this opportunity to express my views on when is the right time to initiate clinical trials in children. And I just like to say, I echo the sentiments of Prof. Moji on her excellent presentation. And I think the emphasis should be on collaborating. The huge hurdle that we face when doing clinical trials is getting informed consent from the parents, and this is the ideal time to be creative And also there's a no one size fits all formula. So we can't extrapolate data from adults to children, even to your neonatal population. So my views is very much from a pediatrician that's on the floor in the ICU and neonatal unit. I have done some clinical research looking at COVID transmission from mother to child. And yeah, I've sort of got quite a keen interest in where do we go with vaccinating our pediatric population. And being in Africa, just to emphasize that where the rest of, we're part of the population is actually struggling to get access to COVID-19 vaccines. So the question arises that whether vaccinating children can sometimes feel like a privilege. So we know that from data that SARS-CoV-2 is much less likely to cause serious illness in children. And although in saying this, some children do become very ill, and I've seen this admissions in ICU. And there's also the spectrum of long COVID to take into consideration, as well as your multi-system inflammatory syndrome. And this is enough for many pediatricians to urge vaccination as quickly as possible. In some countries, including your low middle income countries, little is known about COVID-19 effects on children. And data collection is very, I wouldn't say not accurate, but data, there's not enough data that's been collected. And to emphasize on the way officials are actually telling your number of hospitalization and deaths due to COVID-19, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, does not break down the cases by age. And because of this, pediatricians doesn't know much whether the death has occurred in children population or in young adults. And more closer to home, we don't know much about the outcomes of COVID-19 and how it is affected by conditions which is very rife in our country: malnutrition, concurrent tuberculosis, as well as we got one of the highest HIV infection rates. Next slide, please. Pediatricians are very much concerned what also happens to your children that are co-infected with SARS-CoV-2 and other common viruses. That's been kept at bay by social distancing as well as lockdown regulations. Of concern also is close-knit family structures where children tend to have frequent contact with their grandparents, which might have waning immunity after vaccinations. And often some of these children travel abroad to attend school. Data has shown that children, particularly your adolescents, can play a significant part in transmission of COVID-19. And transmission by children and adolescents are growing as new coronavirus variants emerges. And it's of greater concern that the more transmissible variants will develop a way of overcoming some of the resistance that your children have to infection. Next slide, please. The hopes of achieving herd immunity in our country is through immunization has quickly waned. So I can't emphasize much that countries need to do their best in trying to keep transmission low. The indirect impact of COVID-19 is huge still. We've had school closure for quite a long time, and the effect on long-term learning could be devastating. I do pose questions, 2 questions. I don't know if it will be coming up later, but are wealthier countries vaccinating children at the expense of healthcare workers and high-risk groups in other countries? And should clinical trials on children and COVID-19 vaccinations should have commenced a year ago, together with your adult trials, to provide enough evidence on safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccination. And improving infrastructure networking would translate to adequate resources, training, and collaborations among different centers within a country as well as other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. And I think we heard a lot of interesting points from academic, epidemiological, clinician point of view. So I think I'm asking our colleagues who organize this call how much time we'll have for questions now. And we can start with perhaps, if we go to the previous slide, if it's possible, because this panel is supposed to be about
just to say you have about 20 minutes or so, or 23.
Yes. All right.
Thank you.
So very rightly, there was a question there, which perhaps we can start from. Should the clinical trials of children and COVID vaccination have commenced a year ago to provide enough evidence of safety and efficacy? Is there any members of our panel or even participants that would like to attempt to answer that? Dr. Aurora, perhaps, see you turning your camera on.
Thank you. It is easier said than done in hindsight, but I think it is absolutely right then that when the trials started, there was some information, almost 8 or 9 months of information was available that children are less affected. And that probably may be the reason. But now today, and I really like the example of a Spanish flu, where again, the similar kind of picture was there. So I thought some of the prerequisite now when trials are being done, the DART kind of studies should become integral part of regulatory processes. mRNA has been allowed primarily because DART studies were done and then used in pediatric age group and pregnant women also. So if some of these things are done, then we should, and I think always, because sometimes we may not see acute effect, as very rightly said, I also mentioned, and the other panelist, that we do not know the long-term effect. We do not know what long COVID will have its impact on cardiac and other disorders of for adults, but similarly, it can affect the children. We know about MIS-C, and which is a vascular disorder affecting almost every organ. So completely agree, but again, I will emphasize regulatory processes have to change. Second, attitude of scientists as well as regulators have to change so that we prepare ourselves a life course approach. We talk about life course approach for vaccination or any kind of therapy or approaches. Similarly, so children should always be taken right from the beginning, and the attitudinal change will bring about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I agree with the sentiment. Sometimes it's easier said than done. And from a regulatory point of view, even if somebody like myself, who is a bit more comfortable with the thought of including children in pediatric trials, COVID was perceived as a new disease by some people. So there was that additional element. I noticed a question on the forum that talks about how can clinical trials involve pediatrics and demonstrate efficacy with the COVID vaccines due to the low susceptibility of our children to the infection. And I think this is a question about endpoints on the trial that was mentioned by Dr. Koo, and taking our Keynote's creative call for creative protocol. Dr. Koo, would you like to discuss how we perhaps need to be more creative in clinical trial protocols and endpoints for emerging diseases such as COVID, but also for rare diseases where very little is known, so we can have that initiation of trials? Thank you.
Yes, it's because historically we have this hierarchy of research where clinical trials reign supreme. But when you come to analyze in the real world, you should also look into the appropriateness of these treatments. And so from that, you come to consider the different aspects. And from the COVID-19 experience, it's more on the mental health of the children. So even if they are not that susceptible to the disease, they are affected by the regulations, the restrictions. Like my friend's son, who is a soccer player, has to undergo PCR testing every week just so he can play soccer. My child had to stay at home and learn online, and it was affecting her because her social life was not that much developed at that time. And so if we now look at the rate of depression and anxiety on children, the waiting time for psychological counseling for children is very big now as compared to pre-COVID times. So if they are not vaccinated, then they are still subjected to these restrictions. When they travel, they have to undergo quarantine, they have to undergo PCR testing because they don't have the vaccine certificate. So even if they are not susceptible to the illness, we have to look into the other causes of suffering for them, which may affect, in the end, their productivity when they mature and be our sources of income in the future. So I'm thinking very dirty, not just on mortality and morbidity, but to the wider implications of this COVID pandemic on children.
Thank you very much. And perhaps this is the space where pediatric needs to consider more of a quality of life type of endpoints, which us regulators we are a bit uncomfortable with that data. We like numbers and scores and stuff, but very interesting questions. I note a question on the Q&A. Should we break down trials more? There's clinical development plans, what trials and when, and then there is the planning of individual trials, and that's the actual conduct of trials. Doing the first two earliest, could speak the third when the time is right. Do we have any thoughts about this? Perhaps from our clinician member of our panel, Dr. Ramdin. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. How easy is to plan for individual trials when you are a busy clinician, particularly in a busy neonate or intensive care unit? And what's the burden for conducting those trials?
Thank you, Angelique. So I think it's very much a juggling act, trying to get the right formula of being physically in the ICU, in the neonatal unit, and conducting big trials at the same time. So you got to sort of have your hands on everything and see everything is done correctly as well. So like there's no making mistakes on either side. Firstly, from your on the clinician part in ICU, I mean, otherwise you're going to increase mortality, and also getting the trials right. I think with more hindsight now that I've been involved in more clinical trials, I think it's getting everybody on board in the unit. So I've seen that getting more doctors involved, getting your research coordinator, a data capturer, that has made a huge impact in terms of getting trials run, and also quality control checks, which are quite important. I mean, you want to have high quality studies and outcomes. I think that that's very important to me. Not just having these huge ongoing trials without good quality data at the end of the trials. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Oh, certainly do. Certainly about, the quality of the data. These are not inverted comma academic exercise. They have to have an outcome, which is improvement of medicines and improvement of health. So thank you very much for that. I'm just looking at a question that has come to the chat. Do we have any data of how parents think about involving their children in COVID trials earlier than before adequate data in adults? I have an anecdotal information about that. There was a pediatric trial in UK run by an academic institution, and it was posed at one point for consideration of safety information emerging. And it was fed back to us that the parents were very, and the children actually themselves, because we have to remember it's a child's prerogative and right to participate in a trial. They were getting upset that the trial was not continuing. But it is about building that assurance in the trial itself. I have Dr. Tanasker. Please. Oh, yes. Sorry, Dr. Ramdi.
Maybe I can just answer to that, but I think in very much in South Africa, there's a huge problem. So we're calling vaccine hesitancy. There's reluctance from our population. So more so the adult population. I don't know how we're going to become creative in getting children enrolled in studies. And we've recently started enrolling age group 6 months to 17 years in the Sinovac COVID-19 trial. And well, it's a huge problem in getting adults to vaccinate. I can't imagine the challenges we'll face in getting the pediatric population vaccinated.
I think this is an interesting discussion, again, about the timing of the trials, where you have spaces of rare diseases where us as regulators, we are under a lot of pressure for the trials to commence as early as possible, even if the assurances for the safety is not there, because you have motivated group of patients who wish to have options, compared to the vaccine hesitance, which is also a very important factor to understand how it affects clinical trials. So there's another question on the Q&A. Are there regional differences that may require modification of local study designs? I can start by answering that question from a regulatory point of view. As much as I would like to say no, there might be regional differences, but there has been a lot of trying international collaboration for pediatric trial designs in order to have international trials, and colleagues from EMA and from FDA are in this group if anybody wants to speak further on that. And I think COVID was an example where regions have come together. Anybody of the members of the group want to comment on this further? Barbara, perhaps, or other colleagues?
Just to say, I'd be hard pressed to find regulatory differences that would impact study design. The age of entry is quite different country to country because people define children differently. The enthusiasm for including adolescents and younger people in adult trials is also different. I think that the local acceptability of standard of care versus placebo versus other also is different, but I'm not sure that, the study design questions are so challenging, although choosing the study design is itself, but I defer to others.
Of course, I quite agree. And what you said there, it's also remind me a comment that Dr. Aurora made about the safety monitoring. I do have a strong safety sort of background currently, and it would be interesting to expand a little bit, Dr. Aurora, on this, on, all of us are more comfortable talking, is the vaccine working, or is a drug that we developed for COVID, is it working? Is it more that we can do to get that safety information from trials in children where they have methodological issues, and we heard about reduced sample size? But just your thoughts further on the safety, and perhaps bringing Dr. Koo into that question as well. Thank you.
So, because I'm fresh from another meeting where we were discussing DNA vaccine, which India has come out, and its use in children. So safety for children, for adults, when we introduced, we talk about, as you rightly said, efficacy and safety. But in children, when we come down, usually we kind of extrapolate, not wrongly, that if it is efficacious or effective, it should be here. The immune response may be differing a little bit, but it should be. But it is the safety concern for pediatric age group, which is of paramount importance. And for parents particularly, safety is a very important issue. And that is what I was trying to say, that if, for example, in a current scenario where new platforms are coming up and new vaccines are there, initial rollout in children can be in a phased manner so that they're part of the trial. I think they are being followed up like anybody else. The numbers may be less, but when they are approved for larger number of children in a very, I would say, a structured environment, if the rollout is done in a limited manner and safety is monitored for a longer period, I think that would be something which would give confidence to everybody involved. And particularly in our kind of setup where the routine surveillance, ADR surveillance, is not robust enough. Most of the times, one may report, as I know, for vaccines in India particularly, it is first 7 days only, while we are talking about 28 days or 3 months after a dose kind of thing. So if we do this limited rollout and monitor in a active manner if there are any adverse events or adverse reactions, probably that would be very useful. It will be also, I think, we will be able to pick up some of those, what we are calling as AESIs or something. But for children particularly, so we may not hold the rollout, but rollout done in a limited manner so that beyond the, because we know, for example, myocarditis has been picked up only when the larger rollout took place, not limited rollout. So similarly, a limited rollout where reasonable number of individuals, children are there and monitored for safety meticulously. And I think we do need data not only from high income, but I think low income and resource constrained environments. It's necessary because the response, the disease, the immune responses because of the background infection rates may be different. And so it may be worthwhile looking at.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Dr. Koo has some, and also if we can think about, I know perhaps it's not for you to answer, there was this discussion about, for example, in COVID trials, children with comorbidities should be included. How does that challenge us further when we are talking about safety? Thank you, Dr. Koo.
First, I'd like to supplement what Dr. Aurora has said, because this COVID-19 is new and there are a lot of unknowns up to now, but it has been demonstrated that the multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, ethnicity matters. So the incidence was higher among Black, Hispano, Latino, Asian, and Pacific Islanders as compared to American descent or European descent. So this gives us some idea that there could be an immune response based on ethnicity. And so I do agree that this should not prevent us from moving forward this research on children for vaccines, but that it should be monitored. And then, can I ask and what was your second question?
Yeah, I think as you say, monitor of safety is a big question, and in the UK we've learned so much about with the yellow card and you know all the safety signals that we have seen emerging after vaccinating millions of people, and it's quite clear within clinical trials you'll never see the rare events. You know, you need bigger rollouts, but it is a I hear it from a clinical trials regulator colleagues. It's the safety that is the safety argument why children are not included in the trials. And it's easy for us to say perhaps children with some comorbidity should be included in trials. And the same in cancer trials, you start with severe patients. Yes. and move.
Yes.
How can we learn from that safety approach, if you like, and generalize those findings to make us comfortable?
Yeah, from a pragmatic point of view, then it would be weighing the benefits and the risks when it comes to safety. So that is why you said, what about children who have comorbidities? Or even for the recovery trial, it's children who were hospitalized because of COVID. So that's where they started. So here, then you have an argument that the benefits of starting some kind of treatment on them for COVID would definitely outweigh the risks of this treatment that is yet unknown on what it will cause them to as a reaction. So it's just a pragmatic approach for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have time, Barbara. Oh, Barbara, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to argue a little for the complexity of that statement or of this analysis, because, unlike cancer clinical trials where the kids or adults are sick and you're treating them without other options, here you're taking what we would call a vulnerable population, children with even more vulnerability, comorbidities, and treating them in a preventive sense with unknown or poorly understood safety profile and an unknown, although marginally increased, risk of disease from COVID. So I think the equation very much is balanced by sort of how much we know and how sick or likely sick the kids are going to be. And the challenge is we just didn't know that. And we've only learned that over time. So creating, sort of a plan for this going forward, I think is obviously challenging, but where international cooperation, I think, is really important, because the waves of infectivity were different across the different countries. I see Professor Moji wants to contribute, if that's okay.
Please, Professor Moji.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this panel discussion a lot. The safety of children in clinical trials has to evolve from a new mindset, a new approach to clinical trials. There was a time when women were not included in clinical trials. That era changed, or the attention was not paid on women. And we have to start thinking of children from phase 2, possibly. Because if we don't have this mindset, we may be saying the same thing in 10 years' time. For pandemic, we can give ourselves an excuse that this rolled up on us unexpectedly. But what have we learned? It is that children can also get sick. If children can get sick, then we should, at a point, include them. Again, the dark approach is extremely important. Talking of the ivory tower academic randomized trial type of approach will not work, may not work for all clinical trials in children. How informative is the data we are getting? And that is why this design, design, activate, and communicate approach is extremely important. With limited number, one of the panelists presented something on very limited number of children. In fact, that has already posed a challenge anyway for rare diseases. So what do we do when N is very small? Yeah. Can we get something out of it that will now take us to the next step? So that creativity has to be there, because sometimes you read literature, oh, it's not randomized, it's not this, therefore it doesn't have value. That mindset has to change, generally speaking. Over, thank you.
Yes, and I'm looking at a comment in the chat that agrees strongly in safety, but setting the bar high would slow down. Absolutely. And I spoke in my presentation about perceived vulnerability. And it's the safety that you perceive as, oh, it's a child that don't know nothing, it's a drug from the same class. With regards to the comment from Barbara about, the COVID trials and a vaccine in a disease that is not perhaps a serious burden. I think what I have to say is I was interested to see in the UK, although those trials, us as pediatric regulators, we're pushing for them, to have pediatric trials on immune compromised. The department that deals with the vaccine distribution and rules of vaccination, if you like, for the population, they already had advised that vulnerable children should be vaccinated way before the trials. So for me, that's the kind of, us regulators, and we are sitting in a box discussing, but there's clinicians on the ground, neonates is another example. No matter how many drugs I don't regulate, those neonates are in that ward and they will get some drug, and they will get the same way as, severe children, the clinicians were giving them the COVID vaccines way before we even started discussing what a pediatric immunocompromised trial looks like. So yes, absolutely. And I think I'll stop here because I think we are running out of time, but it has been a great honor.
Keep going on.
It has been a great honor being with this panel. I want to thank the members of this panel and also the team that invited us and gave us this forum to help contribute a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And there's so many issues that have been raised that we need to further explore together. Let me thank the panel and say that we are going to take a 5-minute break and come back together for panel 2. You can keep logged on and just turn off your video and sound, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Moji, and thank you to our panelists. It's been terrific. Thank you. So let me welcome everyone back. It is now 5 minutes have passed, and we're looking forward to a second panel this morning, hopefully as dynamic as this morning's or the panel one and our keynote speaker was. I can't say I've ever learned more about the complexities of the international setting and figuring out how to do what we need to do to ensure the safety of our children in the future. What we're going to be discussing today is in this panel are the infrastructure needs. How do we really set up an international network of trained sites, governance, coordination, resources, training, IT, if that's necessary, to really enable the kind of future understanding and a clinical trial platform that we would like to deploy for the next pandemic, if there is one, and there will be one, or for other diseases. And to address all of those issues, Pirkko Leppola, who comes from an international setting in Finland, having run not only the FinPed Med, but also in Prima, a collaboration with EMA and many of the network sites in Europe. And she is going to be joined by Dr. Lasine Tsienge from the University Teaching Hospital of Kigali in Rwanda, Dr. Marie Valentin from the World Health Organization in Switzerland, who really coordinates the regulatory group in pediatrics, and Dr. Vasantha Muthuswani, who is the former Senior Deputy Director General of the ICMR and the current president of FERCI, the Forum for Ethics Review Committees in India, from India. And I have to say, two of the folks on this have been on the planning committee for this conference, and I thank you all for your participation. Pirkko.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you very much. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone around various places. And I just learned that there is please go to the first slide. I have some few words before I go on with this. So unfortunately, there have been some earthquake probably in Japan. I'm really sorry about to hear that. But the very welcome news, what have been probably you have heard today, it's really nice to hear some happy news. We have learned, and I have learned from the social media that the World Health Organization has approved the recommendation of first ever malaria vaccine for children for the sub-Saharan Africa. So this is really huge news, global news. And I thank the organizers, of course, for this. And to today's topic, it's very interesting for myself, and it's very close to my heart, as I've been working for last 15 years to find out the answers to this very same question: how do we create and sustain a network for the conduct of ethical pediatric clinical trials? So next slide, please. I shall put some volume if you can hear me better. So from my perspective and experience, and now I'm probably repeating something would have been heard previously in the first keynote presentation and the first panel also. But from my perspective, there are these main 6 areas of challenges globally. The first one is the involvement of patients and families and the public awareness. And this is effective due to the following reasons. The children and their families should have space and opportunity to take an active role in drug development and the design of the trials, because the voice of the patients should be noticed in all parts of the development process to have more understandable and recruitment materials and more acceptable and doable protocols. This also increases the trial commitment and treatment compliance. And we know that low awareness causes low and slow recruitment. And the second category is the knowledge and experience, what we have heard already partly, that it affects all stakeholders around this topic. And this is probably the most critical part of these challenges. When there is a rather small number of experts around the globe in the field of pediatric clinical trials, and due to the historical facts that we have had quite short timeline to have the practice and experience of the pediatric clinical trials. And moreover, there is this very small niche area about pediatric clinical pharmacology, where the experts in each country can be usually calculated only by the fingers. And it's clear that the expertise is sparse. The third category is about the ethics and regulations, and this is the main reason we are now collected here into this webinar, thanks to MRCT organizing this. But this is the rather short historical evolution also in this area. So the ethical aspects, together with the valid regulations, create the framework for all research work and setting the whole context of safe and high quality controlled environment for clinical research, and producing reliable data and surveillance safety data for the regulatory purposes. And that was mentioned in the previous session also. Well, the challenges rely on these discrepancies, what Barbara already told about, that there are differences between the countries and it varies, the requirements varies between the countries. And still, if we have the regulated environment like now in Europe, the one example is that we're going to have a new clinical trial regulation in Europe, which will harmonize the clinical trial application process. But in any way, the ethical requirements will remain within each member state. And there will be these differences between the countries regarding the informed consent and assent requirements. And this creates the discrepancies and really can have a challenge to multi-center trials. And additionally, a non-uniform guidance. We know that there is no not harmonized guidance yet for the pediatric clinical trials, not enough. So the initiation of trials can be challenging. The fourth category is the time and timing. We heard something about that also already. But it's a really important aspect and component, because when we talk about pharmaceutical products, one of the most consistent aspects and hindering effect in many countries is the chronic lack of time, devoted time for clinical research at clinics for the personnel. As the priority usually in hospitals is the healthcare, and the time is limited, so you have to really have the reserved time to do the clinical work. And on the other hand, when we talk about the global pharma industry and the related business, it's acting very, very competitive environment where the research opportunities and contracts need to be decided very fast. And it's good to notice the fact that the drug discovery overall usually takes a lot of time. Usually it can be a decade until we get a new marketed product. And the slow patient recruitment makes the situation even worse, slowing the process and increasing the costs. The fifth category, it covers the training and tools for all stakeholders. This is clear one missing piece of the bigger landscape picture, and there is not enough proper training opportunities, focused programs, not enough proper material or research tools to designing and planning and conducting these pediatric clinical trials. And the last one is, of course, this infrastructure and networks. And this is the key success with the small patient populations. And this is really important category as the majority of children are usually healthy. And there is a very small number of patients scattered across the globe. And on the other hand, in the case of large vaccine research programs, as we have discussed previously today, it may be difficult to organize such a trial setting for the health of children. And to protect the children from the unnecessary trials, it is really challenging if only individual research group do and conduct their very small trials and not considering the possible overlapping effect. And without harmonized practices, such as unified methods for structured data collection, standardized data dictionaries, reliable performance metrics for research processes, and all these, the processes can be very cumbersome and ineffective and costly, and it may result unreliable data, especially if it takes long time to solve the troubles and problems. Next slide, please. So what could be then the enablers to create the sustainable research structure for pediatric clinical trials? I've listed here some main enablers, what I think could be part of the solving the previously listed and heard challenges. The availability of targeted funding instruments. We need funding which is devoted and targeted to the infrastructures and increasing resources need. The flexibility and just the timing requirements of global pharma industry, innovative solutions for language differences and cultural and religious traditions through our collaboration, harmonized ethical understanding with respect of national requirements, and harmonized legal and regulatory guidance also for pediatric clinical trials. That has been requested previously. And increased knowledge and expertise for trial design and trial conduction, and the availability of commonly accepted guidelines and tools for the trial conduction, and the established research networks and increased global collaboration, which is now, this is a good example of this webinar. But the increased opportunity, we never have to, we always have to remember the patients and parents' involvement, that we should allow them to take part of the processes. Okay, next slide, please. So this was kind of a fast food info and my thoughts for the panelists and for the audience. And the next we will hear the more extensive presentations and more about these topics in the following panel discussion. And then after that, there is a time for questions and comments and suggestions. So thank you from my side. And we are happy and honored to hear first Dr. Lisine Tuisinge from Kigali, Rwanda. So thank you. Please, you may start.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. So I'm really happy to be part of this panel to share my thoughts on pediatric clinical trial, especially in our setting. So I think we learned a lot with the COVID-19 pandemic, as previously said, and this is a good time to wake up and think about how worldwide we can work together to create and sustain a network for the conduct of pediatric clinical trials. So I think everyone agrees with me that we can't continue to cut tablets in 2 or 4 parts to be able to treat kids as there is no appropriate medicine for children in this or this condition. So we're still struggling with medical devices, for example, adaptable for age, among other examples. So this shows the importance of doing pediatric clinical trials to help in appropriate management of pediatric conditions. But some factors are challenging us in this journey, including the lack of or few children hospitals or pediatric research centers for safe and effective pediatric clinical trials. And even in existing hospitals, there is no places dedicated to research, especially clinical trials. We need really sustainable research tools in those hospitals, procedures, data management, and the electronic medical record system were established and were functioning. Also, we need a proper training of investigators in those hospitals, especially training in pediatric clinical trials, GCP, for example, but also training on paper writing and publication and so on. We need also to reinforce and sustain our laboratories in equipment, in reagents, because in our settings, we are experiencing many times stock out of reagents. So this can help us to reduce money and the time which are used in sample transfer to outside of our country. So we need also to build capacity for our ERBs, especially in pediatric clinical trials, protocols evaluation. And this is something which can strengthening those ERBs to help researchers to improve their research and their progress in publication. I can say also pharmaceutical industries are not available in our setting, and they are involved in research funding, we know, and they can help to researchers to improve their research, especially in clinical trials. So finally, MRCT Center collaboration is the key for experience exchange and help each other to improve the way we are doing things and accelerate publication process. So we have many things to accomplish, but this is possible if a network is established and sustained. Few examples to sustain or to establish this network. We need to create international links between sites, research sites, but also if researchers can participate in international conferences to know each other, to update each other, and this will help us to network and establish agreements between sites and collaborate in clinical trial research. So thank you so much for this time given to me to express my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. I pointed out very, very good points you mentioned. We have to take these further, but we continue the discussion after the presentation. So I may welcome our next speaker, Dr. Vasanta Musudvami from India. So please, the floor is yours. We can take the perspective from after all the speakers. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this introduction. I would like to thank first Barbara and Lisa for giving the opportunity for us to speak on this, and to Professor Mojisola for giving such a wonderful introduction to the entire topic today, and Mrs. Prico for setting the background for this particular panel. Next. When we look at the pediatric population, it's not a single group of population which everybody talks when you're talking of adult. When you talk of adult clinical trials, it's an adult is one group. But when you come to the pediatric group, the concerns are many, because we are talking about neonatal age group, we are talking about toddlers, we are talking about the school-going children, and we are talking about adolescents. So here we are facing 4 different groups of children with different levels of physiological development, different levels of immunological capacity, capabilities, and then they are not, which none of the group is free from any illness, and any kind of illness can happen to them, and depending upon their age or into the general population. So we have to involve all this group of children into clinical trials. And so planning and designing a clinical trial in the pediatric group is not as easy as we do it for the adults. And that's the reason that there are a lot of concerns that how would you, when you want to involve each one of these groups, no, none of the groups can be neglected because each group has its own problems. And we'll have to have a very good study design and which people can understand why and what is the kind of a follow-up which has to be done for each of this group. Next. Now the next slide is generally, of course, this is known to all of us because everybody has been talking about the COVID related studies and COVID vaccine trial. Now, when I just looked into the pediatric clinical trials in general, of course, this is a general guidance which all of us know for research in children, for which we have national and international guidelines that, of course, the scientifically it should be good and the potential benefits should outweigh the potential harm to the children, especially to the particular children who are involved in the studies. And of course, the team of investigators should have the requisite expertise. So those who are non-pediatricians, those who are not trained in conducting pediatric clinical trials, if they are involved in doing the trials, and then there is a major problem because they don't understand the importance of each one and any signal which is coming, which has to be picked up as early as possible. The research, of course, involved children should take into consideration the unique physiology, anatomy, psychology, as we heard from everybody. And what is important, which we always say in all the guidelines, is research must be conducted in a child-friendly environment. When we have such a range of group of children, what is it which mean a child-friendly environment? Children are brought to the hospital, they are brought to the healthcare center for involved in various trials. And how do we make it a comfortable environment for the children? And of course, as far as the pharmacokinetics part of it is concerned, and it is of course different. And till recently, it has been dinned into everybody's head that we don't have to do anything in children immediately. Let us wait for the data from the adults. And then we can see that how do we interpolate it into the children and see it can be done. And now we realize that children are a separate group by themselves. And then what is done in the adults cannot be simply extrapolated in children because children have their own diseases which have to be looked into from the different aspects and they have to be taken care of. During the next slide, please. What happened in the, during the COVID-19 pandemic, what has happened is that, of course, there are a lot of restricted movements were there. The children as well as adults were not able to reach the research sites, the hospitals, not only for the new studies, for the ongoing studies. So that there is a lot of difficulties happened and many of the ongoing studies and the non-COVID related studies have almost come to a halt. Even when the new studies were initiated, it was said that many of the IRBs, what we call institutional ethics committees in India, the IECs, they thought that under the current pandemic, you have to only look into the COVID studies and let us push back all the other studies as well as much as that all the ongoing studies related to the TB interventions or to the malnutrition, nutritional related studies, it can be anything for the children. Now all the studies have come to a kind of a grinding halt and then which has caused a lot of difficulties for the children. Of course, over the period of time, we have learned that the interventions which cannot be delivered initially because children are the adults are not able to reach the research side, that how do we do the domestic delivery of the IPs has been slowly learned by the pharmaceutical company, the sponsors and the others have accepted it. And similarly, getting the consent became a major issue in this, whether it is for adult and of course it's more difficult for the children. So at least for the adult, we adopted the digital or the telephonic consents for involving them into various studies. But in case of children, very difficult to do all these things, whether to get them in digital consent or digital assent. And the parents have to be first explained and then the children have to be involved. And as a result, what has happened in the last more than 1.5 years is that all still children related studies have taken a complete backseat. Of course, the sponsors have now come out with alternate methods of recruitment, the consent procedures, community engagement, delivery of products and everything. And what is to be seen is that what we learned during this COVID situation for handling COVID, can we apply all this in the future? Because slowly we are learning that whatever has happened during the COVID pandemic is going to be the new normal, because many of the things have become quite convenient that we don't have to follow the routine earlier procedures, and these new procedures are more patient friendly. They are more consumer friendly. It has become easy for the sponsors as well as researchers to adopt this. So what is it which has been done and gradually is becoming a new normal? But then, since majority of the institutions or their investigators have almost stopped doing research in the areas, now what we need is that how do we make them understand these new methods and new techniques so that in future this can be adopted and the trials can go on very comfortably. The ethics committees, the IRBs didn't know how to handle the situation and conduct meetings and review proposals. And of course, we have a lot of guidelines which have been coming up, that including the new norm was set up, not only effectively conducting not only the research, even the review mechanisms. We have new set of guidelines coming from WHO as well as individual countries. And this is a guideline, picture of the guideline which we brought out in India and as early as April 2020, as soon as the lockdown started, because many people start approaching us as to how do we organize meetings, how do we conduct it. We came out with the guidelines for the ECs as to how to conduct meetings and look into the various aspects of the vulnerabilities which have been increased due to the current pandemic. So with these new changes which have been adopted, these new norms, how do we see that effectively these are utilized for the future research enterprises? And can these new norms which have been adopted for the adults, can they suit the child-specific research also, especially to the different age group of children? And what is the capacity which has to be developed for getting the consent of the parents as well as the assent from the children? Next. So what I am looking as far as the pediatric trials in future, which is of course where the COVID-19 has taught us a lot of new things. How do we apply it in the future? Because when you talk of a child-friendly environment, as far as a child is concerned, home is the best environment for a child. Is it that now in the future trials, instead of children being brought to the hospitals and having a lot of dislocation, can we, since that now we know that how the interventions can be reached to the families or reached to the home level, can we make the home as the best environment for a child when children are involved in various trials? What are the different kind of training which has to be done for the stakeholders? And today, Dr. Barbara is telling there's a big training program where more than 90 countries have participated in. What is important is at the moment is the very critical of the training of the different stakeholders in this new informed consent procedures and the new ways of conducting the research. And it's not just for the researcher alone, the IRB members, the sponsors, everybody has to be now given the capacity building. And what is also more important it has become is we have been hearing, and of course in the yesterday's session also we were listening to the various COVID vaccine trials and what is to be done. The sensitization of the regulators in all the countries is also very important, that how do we include children from the beginning itself? Don't wait as we have done for the current pandemic. Waited for almost 1 year to involve the children. And now we are talking of we should have done it earlier. Are we late? Have we missed the bus? Have we missed the opportunities? Has it caused more harm to the children by these delay mechanisms? And if that is so, how do we regulate how do we sensitize the regulators that yes, in future for some of the conditions where the illness can happen to the children as well, not only to the adults. Maybe the severity is different, but yes, children are also affected. As we can see in the zero surveillance conducted in India, we have completed 3 zero surveillance and the 4th one is just going to start. We have found that the 10 to 18-year age group children who ever seen, 50% of the children who were studied whose zero surveillance was done, they found to have the antibodies and they found to be positive. That means they faced the infection at some point of time. Maybe they were asymptomatic or they had mild symptoms which did not result in hospitalization. The next involvement, the important sensitization has to be done to the community engagement, in the sense the parents have to be educated, that the parents generally want to protect their children. They don't want their children to participate in the trials unnecessarily. They think that the other children undergo this. Once the product is out in the market, I can use it for my children. Why should my child be involved in the clinical trials? Why should I take the risk of putting my child in a trial situation? So the community and the community of parents especially, and the others, the legal guardians and others, have to be educated that yes, if you want to really protect the children from any illness, they should participate in research from the very beginning. Of course, the safety norms has to be in position, and we have to do proper follow-up, as we heard in the previous panel, that the follow-up of the adverse events to the much longer period than the adults is necessary in children. If you have the safety norms in position, it is necessary that the children have to be involved, since children are not just small adults to apply the adult norms, and they have different requirements in different stages in their life till they become an adult. But what is important in this is, as we have been hearing, is the most important is the networking and collaboration, which is already existing. How do we make a maximum use of this network? Because our experience in the past, I think more than 30 years is that when ICH came out with the international guidelines for clinical trials, it was adopted by all the countries to streamline the procedures for a clinical trial. And this is now accepted by all the countries. Countries have adopted and made their own national, the GCP guidelines, all based on ICH GCP. Now I am looking at the whole thing in the situation that when we have these wonderful networks for pediatric trials, instead of telling the regulators that you look into this and come out with the guidelines for us how to do that, why can't we, as who are part of these studies and the network, come out with the guidelines, global guidelines, which we can hand over to the different regulators and see that, see, with our experience of handling children, this is what we feel should be done for the different age group, a different point for the different illnesses, that how do we involve the children, how do we do the follow-up, how do we take care of them. And this is a kind of a consensus document which we have prepared as an experts, people dealing with the pediatrics. They are handing it over to you and the regulators can accept it. And I think the regulators also must be very happy that it comes from the group of experts, rather than them looking into that, having their own team of expertise to come out with the kind of guidelines for children. So for pediatric clinical trials in future, if you want to come out with a global set of guidelines, which can be adopted by all the countries, like the ICH GCP guideline, yes, I think the present network about which we heard so much from the keynote speaker as well as from the others, that I think this and the MRCT Center, which has started it, I think we have to take up the responsibility to come out with the guidelines. I think that is going to be very helpful for all the countries and all the regulators as well, that in future we do conduct the pediatric research smoothly and don't see that the children are come into the picture at a later stage where we feel that, yes, we have done a mistake and they should have been involved, so that, because if you look at the whole total population of children, if you see in India, the child population that is up to the age of 18 years, at the moment our census data says 30% of our population is 0 to 18 years. If you look at the population in African countries, again, I'm sure is a huge population, is the children population are the one, the future of the world is the current pediatric population in the Asian countries and the African countries. Now, this number is decreasing in the US and the Europe, but compared to all the low income and the developing countries, the pediatric population is the major force and they are going to be the future workforce of the world. If that is so, we have a moral responsibility to see that they are protected from a young age, they do participate, we do take care of them, for which we have very clear-cut guidelines. I think this is what I would like to say from the experience learned from the COVID and how can we plan the future pediatric clinical trials in the world. Thank you all so much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Muthuswani. This was a really, really excellent collection of many important points. We definitely need to come back of some of these. I try to write down many of those you have mentioned. But if we take the last speaker first, Dr. Marie Valentin from Switzerland and from representing the World Health Organization. So with Marie's presentation, and after that we can then continue and start a much more larger discussion, and please create some questions based on the previously heard and create new ones while we are listening Dr. Valentin. So please, Marie, the floor is yours now.
Thanks a lot and good day to you all. First of all, I'd like to thank the MRCT organizing committee for inviting me to this very interesting discussion. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel. And it's nice actually to see some very familiar faces and names from the global pediatric family. If we move to the next slide, please. So first of all, when we started our discussion, I wanted to highlight some introductory thoughts regarding the planning. So I think some of the panelists and speakers I've mentioned already, I think we have to make sure that children are not afterthought. So pediatrics should be thought early in the development. So even when companies develop their program for adults in terms of pharmacokinetic studies or other studies, they should think about how can some of the data can be used to better inform the development in pediatric. And the same for the formulation. I think the pediatric formulation has to be thought about very early in the development. Also, I think we are living exciting times, and we have to make best use of available and existing data. And we know that the International Council of Harmonization is developing a guideline, a specific guideline on pediatric extrapolation. And I think it's very important to use the data that we have from other age group or adults to better inform the development of product in children. Also to optimize the design of pediatric pharmacokinetic studies and use model-based approaches, for example, or also to assess or evaluate the acceptability of palatability within the PK trials. What we can do as a network is to promote best practices. And this has been mentioned already in some of the discussion today, but to include adolescents in adult trials when we can, enroll pediatric cohorts simultaneously rather than sequentially. So we saw that historically, this sequential approach or create some delays for the younger patients. So we have to try to move to a more simultaneous approach where possible, and also to systematically use standardized weight band dosing in the clinical trials and in the pediatric development plans. What is very important as well, and it's been mentioned, is the alignment of pediatric plans and early discussion with regulators. And we know that regulators have a lot of collaboration in terms of trying to harmonize this plan globally. Next slide, please. One of the other important aspects is the prioritization, as it is the first critical step to enable a more targeted approach to research and development. So we know that the pediatric world is a difficult world. There are not a lot of resources, so we have to make sure that we focus our efforts. And just as an illustration, the work done by the WHO Pediatric Drug Optimization, the PADO exercise, that has been done for HIV, HCV, and tuberculosis. It's very important because it gives more clarity to develop product for global public health. So this results in priority lists containing priority formulation for pediatric to be investigated and developed in the next 3-5 years, and also a watch list with promising candidates. And this allows to concentrate and focus effort where it's most needed. Harmonization and alignments, I think many of the speakers have mentioned it as well, the importance of sharing pediatric data, the importance of public-private partnerships, because when we see that we're all working towards the same goal, we can achieve, experience has shown that we can achieve great steps. For example, the example of the dolutegravir 10 milligram pediatric formulation that was authorized only a few months after the originator. So that was a great result for public health to have this pediatric HIV formulation. The harmonization and alignments between partners, very important as well, to all coordinate the work and working together, making sure that we join efforts. Regarding the work of regulators and ethics committee, I think it's very important to look also at building capacities in terms of ethic oversight for pediatric clinical trials. And I'm thinking here of the example of the the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, AVRF in Africa, which is a great platform to allow for joint assessments, and not only regulators, but regulators and ethics committees of clinical trials to be conducted in Africa, for example. And also the WHO good relevance practices and making the best use of regulatory resources. So ensuring that when possible, we can organize some work sharing and sharing assessments and sharing experience between regulators. If we move to the next slide, please. Yeah, just wanted to illustrate and mention to the group a few of the WHO-led networks that are working on pediatric. The first one being the WHO Pediatric Regulatory Network that was reactivated in December 2019. So it's a global pediatric working network, and it serves as a platform for exchange of regulatory information on pediatric medical products and to support the availability of quality assured medical products for children. So this year, the meeting took place virtually, and we had a great engagement from regulators all across the world, all across the globe. I wanted to mention also the Global Accelerator for Pediatric Formulation. So it's a collaborative platform. Again, it's working with different partners with pediatric interest in the field and coordinating the activities and coordinating the action to make sure that we joint effort and we are stronger together. So it's allow for a more efficient and more focused approach to pediatric clinical studies, formulation development, and introduction. And last but not least, the Rom Action Plan, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this initiative. It's a compilation of commitment from key stakeholders to accelerate the research and development of pediatric product for HIV and TB. And they've had 5 rounds, so we're preparing for Rome meeting 6 next year. But they've had great results in putting everybody, all the stakeholders in the same room and making sure that we connect the dots and we work towards the same objectives. And they've been very successful in doing so. And I think that's my next slide as an introduction. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you so much, Marie. So this was an excellent combo of 3 different presentations from various perspectives on the same topic, but very good points. If we, I believe we have some time, approximately about 15 to 20 minutes. Barbara can confirm for the discussion so that we can start and take questions forward. If I take first the questions from the Q&A, there is this question about the PK, the pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics question. There also seems to be a lot of disagreement on extrapolation and efficacy. So people say children are not just little adults, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from the adults. And in many cases, we can extrapolate from efficacy in adults to children. In fact, relevant to COVID infection diseases are area where extrapolation has long been used back on the HIV. This is huge implications for the pediatric plans needed and the types of the trials. Who would like to answer to this question? It was mentioned, especially Dr. Valentin mentioned the extrapolation as one important component of the planning the trial. So would you like to answer these questions, Marie?
Yeah, sure. I can see that also I think someone wanted to answer this question, but definitely I think we pediatric extrapolation is very important. So what we are trying to do is not to duplicate studies when they are not needed. So if the efficacy can be extrapolated, and some of the example for like antiretroviral, and there would be no point in repeating the studies. So it's a very efficient tool to allow for better development in children, and only conducting the studies that are required for additional data required in children. But I see that someone's wanted to answer this question live. So I don't know, it's Walker Morel.
No, thank you. I was just activating this so that other participants could see
Okay.
it. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
No worries. So yes, no, definitely, it's very encouraged.
Can I ask a further question about that? Are there characteristics of different products that make it more or less likely that extrapolation is trustworthy? Monoclonals, have a pretty wide dose response curve, so I could see how that would be okay, but it seems like there's some other drugs where the different metabolism in pediatrics would be make it harder to extrapolate. Is that known? Angeliki seems to be wanting to answer this.
Hardly such a complex issue about metabolism and dose response. Certainly not my areas of expertise. I think the fundamentals of extrapolation for regulators are well set, and the concept of extrapolation is discussed with every PIP submission in Europe, certainly, and also in UK, and I presume also in FDA. And it is about, as you say, things as metabolism and drug targets and what I want to add that the PK and PD data that is needed and what type of studies we request, that's a full range. So extrapolation is not a one-off. It's from full extrapolations all the way to full development, and there is this whole range, and it is about having that discussion about what you need and when you need it and when you can initiate it, and whether you have your partial extrapolation and you need in some population your PK dose confirmation type of things. And the other thing I find challenging with extrapolation, and perhaps in infectious disease, is, and I don't know the answer to that, but yes, extrapolation, if you look at efficacy, for a vaccine, perhaps is antibodies development, etc., and maintenance over time. But for pediatrics, we just heard in the previous panel that this is not the disease that causes problems. So I think a lot of the studies in COVID vaccines were partial extrapolation. They weren't full-blown benefit risk type of pivotal studies. But then you have a disease that doesn't, for some mysterious reason, doesn't behave the same way in children and adolescents. So, there is the limitations that we all know for extrapolation, but at the end of the day, as Marie says, it's not about duplicating, and it's doing the right program for the right drug and for the right population. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeliki. And I will have a question from Hide Nakamura from Japan. And it's about question of formulations. We heard just about how important it is to have a correct formulation. The palatability and the acceptability is really important when we talk about pediatric medicine users and the patients. So Hide wants to know that looks like that there are less than 10 medicines that have the major problem in children in either taste, acceptability and or stability. And this was, I lost the question. So, and this was one of the topics at the European Pediatric Formulation Initiative meeting that was held in the month. How can the GAP-F, so that Dr. Valentin showed this formulation initiative, how that could solve this global problem? Is it very difficult to have industry to develop appropriate formulation to the old medicines? Would you like to take this first, Marie, and then others if you have further comments?
Yeah, sure. I think it's many questions combined in one, but for the accessibility, it's very high. Obviously, it's very important, and it's very high on the agenda for the GAP-F activities. It depends very much on the molecule itself, on the component, because we know that, for example, in HIV, unfortunately for the antiretroviral, they've had a lot of issue with some of the molecule with the bitterness, which can really impact the compliance of taking the medicine for these children. Within the GAP-F, we coordinate a lot of studies to work on this palatability and looking at criteria, how it can be better assessed and how it can be better defined. So it's very important to look, and if it has to be masked, or how can it be render more palatable for children, looking at the formulation. Regarding developing, asking industry to develop the formulation, we know that it's very difficult. So what we've learned from the different last years, I think it's the dispersible tablet are a good option because they allow for more flexibility within the age group. And a lot of the speakers have mentioned, when we look at pediatric, it's not one single population. We look at a very different age group with different maturity levels. So the fact to have dispersible tablets can allow a bit more flexibility in the dosing, and it's what we are looking at for the global public health. but it's not easy to encourage industry because the market is really small and not so many incentives to go in those markets.
Thank you, Marie. Is there someone else who has been working around the formulation topic or in practice doing some work around these formulations who would like to have more in details responses? No, I cannot see any additional questions. I would like to go back to the presentations of Dr. Muthuswamy, and as she was explaining, I will take this camera on. She was telling nicely about the new ways how they do, how they have experienced these during these COVID pandemic trials. They have these new practices, for example, the electronic consent or the phone consenting or these other new practical methods. And it was discussed how these methods or practices could go on to new future trials. Do our panelists have a, first of all, to Dr. Muthuswamy, that is the electronic consent officially approved in India to use in clinical trials? And then others the other panelists can comment on that also. Thank you.
Yeah, it's when we came out with the guidelines for the ethics committees, which review proposals during the pandemic, this was one of the options which was given as to what are the alternate methods of getting the consent. So the investigators have to be very clear how they are going to do, how they are going to verify that the other person who is giving the consent is the right person who has to be involved in the clinical research. So there are methods to be done that how do we do that? They can adopt those techniques and say that yes, and it has been used because there are a lot of studies, especially in the adolescent age group. We've been having webinars from the beginning of the pandemic regarding research going on in the adolescent age group, where the main kind of a consent which people were taking is either the telephonic consent or the digital consent through the emails or through the WhatsApp, getting the consent, and or the telephonic surveys were done where it was confirmed that yes, the person speaking is the same, they can do even the recording. So a lot of such studies have been done. Yes, it is accepted. This is what has been used now. And it seemed to be quite easy now that, of course, we have to have all the regulatory requirements in future. But I think that electronic consent is going to be now one of the new norms which is there. Like we have the electronic meetings now, digital online meetings. People were very hesitant. They thought that cannot be proper discussions. They thought that the review process will be incomplete, but it's not happened. I'm chairing the Central Ethics Committee of Human Research in the Indian Council of Medical Research, and we've been having meetings so frequently, and people, because in the beginning it took some time for people to understand the procedures. Now it's very comfortable. People know, the persons have realized that it's a very easy way of having the meeting. Nothing, there is no, the quality of the scientific or the ethics review is not at all compromised. We are able to take proper decisions. So I think these are the kind of things which are happening, and I'm sure that's why these are being called as new norms. I'm sure the others also have similar experience in the other countries.
Okay, thank you. It's good to hear that there have been so much progress also there and caused by this unfortunate pandemic, so that you have been able to create these new methods and expanding. Any others? Have there been any similar practices, or will you be applying these in other continents? Do we have any comments on that?
Dr. Lacine has her hand raised.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think this is really a good discussion, as we had also some experience during the COVID period in our ERB meetings. So to sign electronically the consent forms. So it was a hot discussion because everyone was asking, are we really like, we know that someone else can take the phone and they agree on behalf of someone else. So that was a hot discussion, and some phones are not working. Sometimes the network is not good. So it's really a challenging situation, but also a new way of doing things, especially during this challenging situation of pandemics. So I think it's a way people can explore and improve to be used in a special situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, this is probably a very hot topic because, for example, in Europe, it is a hot topic also. We don't have yet a harmonized understanding or any regulatory guidance which would have been applied to all the countries. We have only the Belgium and the UK, they have these current guidelines, but we're still lacking and waiting for those in this digital area. So Dr. Tanusha Ramdin, you have something to comment, please.
Yes, so I've seen this being proposed for looking into the future for the new GCP guidelines. But I think in Africa, the hugest, a big challenge is actually for our population is having access to computers or laptops in order to get electronic signatures. And so that's one aspect. And the second one challenge would be in South Africa itself, we have 11 different languages. So English doesn't necessarily be, it's not the first language of the person we're trying to consent. So even telephonic or different language ICFs, we probably might need a translator in between person to get consent for a participation in trials. Thank you.
This is extremely important note. The value of all the new methods, it relies on the applicability and the feasibility of using these new elements, and this is definitely very challenging when you don't have the accept or enough the equipments nor the solutions for these language translation problems. Really good point. Any other last comments? I think we are very close to closing time. Do we have any last comments or questions? I cannot see if there is a QA list questions. No. Okay, there is no more questions. So I thank, from my side, thank you very much. And I thank all the panelists and the speakers. It has been really interesting to hear all the comments from various parts of the world. Is there, yes, there is one question. I take this also. Many in industry, academia and regulatory agencies, mostly in higher income countries, have said a positive impact of COVID has been more flexibility in the conduct of clinical trials, in particular wide use of decentralized trials. But such trials depend largely on the underlying healthcare system, which potentially means that the trials, including pediatric trials, will disproportionately be placed in higher income countries. How concerned are you this, and will this limit the access in Africa? So please, Dr. Tuisenge, for example, and then Dr. Mutu. Yeah, Dr. Tuisenge, yes.
Thank you so much. This is a very nice question. I think So I'm just going through again the question because it's a long question. Yeah, we limit access. Okay, so I think in Africa, it's like the health system, in some countries, the health system is well organized. In the other countries, I think the organization is not the same in all countries. And as maybe I mentioned in my presentation, every site or every hospital is not well equipped to conduct clinical trials. So that means bringing clinical trials in Africa without preparing the site and everything, and without going through the health system, the healthcare system, to be sure that capturing data, capturing recruiting participants easily, especially during this pandemic period, because even moving from one district to another district was an issue sometimes if we have really many cases. So those are some limits which can which can be a limit for conducting those clinical trials in our countries. So I think review healthcare system in all countries and harmonize when we need to do clinical trials is a key element to be sure that we are bringing those clinical trials. But again, some countries can be ready to conduct those clinical trials without issues. So that means country by country, we can go through and see what can be done. Thank you.
Angelique?
Thank you so much. Angelique, do you have a old hand, or you probably can have a very short, brief response?
Yes, first of all, one of the learnings I had from this meeting, and I thank Barbara and colleagues for organizing, is to hear that across the globes we're all facing the same problems. There are slightly differences, of course, and the concept of decentralized trial is to lessen the burden for trial participant, but also for the trial conduct, and to free the time that our national health systems don't have to conduct trials, and for a child to go in just to sit in a clinic and fill up, for example, a questionnaire that can be done at home with an app, which most kids are better than me doing these days. So the concept of in my very personal view, is that the concept of decentralized trials should work in lower income countries, as long as the research infrastructure is there. And we have to tap into other sources like our educational system and our community system to conduct this decentralized trial. So in a way, from my point of view, and apologize for that view, maybe that's applicable. And the last comment I have to make is, I do come from UK, but the UK is not just London, or there are areas with deprivation and very poor healthcare outcomes, and children who don't have laptops to do their schoolwork. So I think we have to work across the border to support health, and reduce health inequalities, even within countries where you don't perhaps expect that. And that's what I feel strongly about, health inequality, and WHO initiatives, and in PRIMA is something that are sort of very high in the agenda for that. So thank you for that. Sorry if I'm delaying things.
Thank you. I know we are closing near the closing time, so I say thank you, everyone. Excellent panelists in my group, and excellent points to taking out. I have a lot of notes, and these have been recorded. And Barbara, you can probably tell us more about the practicalities after this wonderful webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all to all the panelists and speakers, and to our keynote speaker today. I can't tell you how much I learned from all of you, and how much this is a shared experience across the globe. I think that while all of the points that have been made are applicable in varying weights and degrees in all of our settings. And, just underlying Angelique's point, we have the same problems in the US with people not only without laptops, but without internet access. So we have to be very thoughtful and deliberate about joining together to really change the future for our children. The slides and the recordings will be available in about a week or so and posted. And, I think that we'll also probably prepare a summary for all of us so that the learnings and the sharing of the kinds of points that were made as an integrated whole, pulling together yesterday and today, or this morning and this evening, depending on where you are in the globe, contributes to the learnings going forward. And again, just let me thank everyone and wish you a healthy future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I hope Japan is fine. You mentioned there was a big earthquake. What happened?
Six
Well, we're fine.